Timothy Patrick Murphy, Dak Rambo, and Tom Fuchello. All three were talented, highly marketable, and at the absolute peak of their television careers. All three were also gay or bisexual men who contracted HIV during the height of the AIDS epidemic. But what ultimately destroyed their lives was not just a viral pathogen. It was a calculated, profit-driven corporate machine that viewed human beings as disposable financial liabilities. When these men required support, the industry weaponized legal contracts against them, stripped away essential health care, and orchestrated systematic cover-ups regarding their deaths. The stage for this silent execution was the biggest show on the planet, Dallas. If you tuned into television during the early 1980s, Dallas was the ultimate symbol of American luxury. It was a billion-dollar money machine, a weekly spectacle of Texas oil tycoons, shoulder pads, and ruthless family betrayals that dominated the global market and defined a decade. But the most devastating betrayals associated with the series were not broadcast on Friday nights. They occurred behind closed doors, where network executives chewed up three beloved icons and threw them out into the street to protect their advertising revenue. Before starting, we've produced detailed, in-depth videos about each of these men. If you want to explore their individual stories and careers in greater depth, head over to our channel to watch those full breakdowns. But for now, we expose how this corporate machine operated, dismantling the myth of the so-called Dallas curse to reveal one of the most cold-blooded corporate cover-ups in American television history. To understand the sheer efficiency of this corporate machine, we must begin with its most meticulously manufactured product and its most silently erased victim, Timothy Patrick Murphy. Born on November 3, 1959 in Hartford, Connecticut, Murphy possessed the exact aesthetic the networks were mass-producing for teenage audiences. He had a striking, clean-cut, quintessential American look. He was ambitious, moving to Los Angeles to navigate the grueling audition circuits. His career began the way many did during that era, with a relentless string of television commercials. He was the fresh face selling consumer products to Middle America, proving his reliability and marketability to casting directors. By 1979, Murphy began securing television roles. He booked a minor part in the miniseries The Seekers and started making the rounds on the episodic television circuit. He landed a recurring role on the daytime soap opera Search for Tomorrow in 1980. Daytime television was an essential training ground. It required actors to memorize massive amounts of dialogue daily and hit their marks with precision, teaching Murphy the strict discipline required for network television production. His transition to film brought him a supporting role in the Bushido Blade in 1981. However, Murphy's trajectory was fundamentally altered when CBS cast him in Dallas during its 1982 to 1983 season. Murphy was brought in to play Mickey Trotter, the rebellious but good-hearted nephew of Ray Krebs. The introduction of Mickey was a calculated demographic strategy by the network. Dallas had a firm grip on the adult demographic, but introducing a young, attractive male character was designed to pull in the lucrative teenage audience and secure covers on magazines like Tiger Beat and 16 magazine. The strategy worked flawlessly. Murphy was an instant hit. His character's romance with Lucy Ewing, played by Charlene Tilton, became a major secondary storyline. He was heavily promoted by CBS PR, sent on press tours, and packaged as the network's newest heartthrob. In 1984, his rising status was solidified when he won the Young Artist Award for Best Young Actor in a Primetime Series. That same year, he secured a highly coveted leading role in the feature film Sam's Son, directed by television heavyweight Michael Landon. Murphy was cast to play Gene Oakes, a character directly based on Landon's own early life. Playing the cinematic proxy of one of America's most beloved television patriarchs was a massive endorsement of Murphy's commercial viability. On paper, Timothy Patrick Murphy had achieved the Hollywood dream. He had a primetime television platform, an award-winning presence, and the backing of powerful industry figures. But the reality of Murphy's existence was sharply divided. Every day he arrived on the set at Lorimar Productions, he was acutely aware of the contract he had signed. He knew that the executives who smiled at him and capitalized on his fan mail would instantly obliterate his career if they discovered the truth. Murphy was a gay man living in the epicenter of an industry that viewed his private life as a toxic financial liability. To survive, Murphy had to compartmentalize his identity. He became a master of evasion during press junkets, carefully navigating intrusive questions from reporters about his dating life. He provided the necessary sanitized quotes about looking for a nice girl to keep the publicity machine running smoothly. But beneath the surface of this glittering success, a massive public health crisis was beginning to quietly infiltrate the heavily guarded gates of Los Angeles. And the very corporate structure that had elevated Murphy to international stardom was already preparing the legal mechanisms it would use to abandon him. Network executives dictated the public image of their stars from heavily guarded boardroom tables, but a completely different power structure governed Los Angeles after dark. For a closeted young actor like Timothy Patrick Murphy, navigating this landscape required maintaining a dangerous, heavily fortified double life. The city was strictly bifurcated. Above ground operated the relentless multi-million-dollar machinery of network public relations. Studios manufactured reality. They assigned female dates to gay actors for high-profile movie premieres. They deployed aggressive publicists to plant fabricated romance stories in teen magazines, feeding a manufactured narrative of heterosexuality to satisfy conservative advertisers and a middle American fan base. Below ground, however, a high-stakes hidden ecosystem thrived. Analyzing the sociology of gay Hollywood in the early 1980s reveals an environment built on absolute paranoid discretion. Because homosexuality was classified as a career-ending liability, a direct violation of standard morality clauses, gay men in the entertainment industry operated within a tightly sealed underground network. Socializing never occurred in public venues. A stray camera flash or an ambitious tabloid reporter lingering outside a West Hollywood bar could instantly destroy a lucrative syndication contract. Instead, the real networking happened behind the high walls of private estates in the Hollywood Hills, at exclusive, heavily guarded, invite-only gatherings. Within this hidden ecosystem existed a formidable power structure colloquially known in industry whispers as the Velvet Mafia. This was not a formal syndicate. It was a loosely connected whisper network of highly successful closeted men, studio chiefs, elite casting directors, prominent talent managers, and established A-list actors. Gaining access to this inner circle offered a young actor like Murphy a vital layer of protection. It provided a rare safe harbor from the exhausting daily performance of the heterosexual facade. More importantly, it served as a crucial avenue for career advancement in an industry that operated heavily on patronage and back-channel recommendations. However, this hierarchy was built on secrecy, leverage, and power imbalances. The relationships within this circle were complex and deeply transactional, frequently blurring the lines between personal intimacy and professional advantage. It was within this intensely secretive, high-risk world that Murphy crossed paths with B. Brad Davis. This relationship remains one of the most volatile and heavily scrutinized intersections of two closeted stars during this era. Brad Davis was not a teen idol. He had exploded onto the cinematic scene with a blistering raw performance as Billy Hayes in the 1978 prison drama Midnight Express, securing a Golden Globe and an Academy Award nomination. Davis projected a volatile, intensely masculine and dangerous energy on screen. He was marketed by the studios as a definitive, gritty leading man, subsequently starring in major prestige films like Chariots of Fire. Later, he would push boundaries by starring in Rainer Werner Fassbinder's highly controversial, queer-coded masterpiece Corel. Yet despite taking on subversive roles, his mainstream Hollywood image was strictly managed to project rugged heterosexuality. Davis was living a deeply compartmentalized, highly fractured life. He was married to a woman, prominent casting director Susan Bluestein. Together, they maintained the necessary domestic facade required by the industry. However, Davis actively and aggressively participated in the hidden gay subculture of Los Angeles. Crucially, any historical examination of Brad Davis must look squarely at his personal accountability and the chaos he brought into his own life. Davis had a severe, well-documented history of extreme substance abuse. He battled chronic, crippling alcoholism and severe intravenous drug use, particularly cocaine and heroin. Davis himself, and later his widow in her biographical accounts, openly admitted that his addiction profoundly compromised his judgment, fueled erratic behavior on film sets, and drove him into increasingly reckless situations within the Hollywood underground. He was not merely a victim of an oppressive system. He was a man actively destroying his own foundation through chemical dependency. The intersection between Timothy Patrick Murphy and Brad Davis was a collision of opposites. Murphy was the squeaky clean, meticulously groomed soap opera star, whose brand relied on wholesome reliability. Davis was the gritty, unpredictable, drug-addicted film star operating on pure, volatile adrenaline. Industry historians and investigative journalists point to a brief, intense, and highly guarded involvement between the two men. They were drawn together by the mutual suffocating pressure of their fabricated public lives, finding temporary solace in an underground network that demanded absolute silence. Yet, their dynamic was inherently dangerous. Murphy needed stability to maintain his grueling television schedule. Davis was a walking liability, his judgment eroded by addiction. They were navigating a treacherous social landscape, entirely unaware that their heavily guarded sanctuary was incubating a biological catastrophe. In 1981, the medical landscape was completely blind to what was coming. The Centers for Disease Control began publishing obscure reports about a cluster of highly unusual, aggressive illnesses. Rare conditions, such as pneumocystis pneumonia and Kaposi sarcoma, were suddenly appearing among young, otherwise healthy gay men in major urban centers like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York. At the time, the disease lacked a formal name, initially labeled with stigmatizing acronyms like GRID. The mainstream press largely ignored it. The federal government remained entirely silent, refusing to allocate funding for research. Information only circulated through terrified, hushed conversations within the gay community. Before the identification of the human immunodeficiency virus and the establishment of basic safe sex guidelines. The hidden social networks of Hollywood operated in total darkness regarding the impending threat. The unrestrained, sexually liberated party culture of the late 1970s and early 1980s, combined with an absolute lack of medical warning or testing infrastructure, created an epidemiological perfect storm. The virus possessed a long, silent incubation period. Men were contracting and transmitting the disease years before displaying a single symptom. It was during this specific period of intense entanglement within these closed high-risk circles, a timeline overlapping directly with his association with Davis and the broader underground scene, that Timothy Patrick Murphy contracted the virus. By the mid-1980s, the invisible threat materialized into a visible, undeniable reality. The virus began to systematically dismantle the immune systems of those infected. For an actor whose entire net worth, syndication value, and career viability were intrinsically tied to his physical appearance, the onset of AIDS was a professional death sentence long before it became a literal one. The physical symptoms of the disease in the 1980s were aggressive and impossible to disguise under harsh studio lighting. Murphy began experiencing the hallmark signs of the disease's brutal progression. He suffered rapid, severe weight loss. His energy levels plummeted due to chronic fatigue. The visible, telltale lesions of opportunistic infections began to appear. The camera lens is a ruthless piece of machinery. It captures every hollowed cheek, every measure of exhaustion, and every physical flaw. The reaction from the Hollywood corporate machinery was instantaneous and clinical. The moment an actor's physical deterioration became apparent, the phone simply stopped ringing. There were no dramatic boardroom meetings, no formal termination letters, and no HR consultations. The industry relied on the cowardice of sudden, total disengagement. Agents quietly stopped submitting his name for roles. Casting directors looked at his recent headshots or screen tests and suddenly decided to go in a different direction, using coded language like "he's lost his look" or "he's lacking energy." Murphy, the golden boy who had recently won a Young Artist Award and starred in a major network soap opera, was abruptly deemed uncastable. The executives who had eagerly capitalized on his boyish charm instantly retreated to protect their own reputations and the brand safety of their networks. Even more devastating, the powerful men within the underground networks, the velvet mafia that previously offered protection, severed all contact. Terrified of being outed by association during a period of intense public hysteria, moral panic, and homophobic backlash, these men slammed their doors shut to maintain their own precarious facades. Timothy Patrick Murphy found himself completely isolated. The industry had extracted his youth, profited immensely from the heterosexual illusion he was forced to maintain, and the moment his body failed to uphold that profitable lie, he was unilaterally erased from the ledger. He was left alone to face a terminal diagnosis, abandoned by the very system that created him. To comprehend the speed with which Timothy Patrick Murphy was discarded, one must examine the cold actuarial mathematics of Hollywood film and television production. The systemic abandonment of actors during the HIV/AIDS epidemic was not driven solely by cultural prejudice. It was rigorously enforced by the insurance sector. The entertainment industry operates on a foundation of risk mitigation. Before a single frame of a television show or movie is shot, the production company must secure cast insurance and a completion bond. These financial instruments guarantee the networkee and the financial backers that the project will be finished on time and within budget. If a lead actor falls ill, the daily holding costs, paying the crew, renting the studio space, maintaining the equipment, can hemorrhage hundreds of thousands of dollars a day. In the 1980s, an actor's physical body was a heavily insured corporate asset. Before commencing work, actors were subjected to rigorous medical examinations by insurance company doctors. When the AIDS epidemic hit, underwriters panicked. Because the disease was entirely fatal and its progression notoriously unpredictable, any actor suspected of carrying the virus instantly transformed from a bankable asset into an uninsurable liability. If an actor could not be insured, they could not be hired. It was a flawless, legally sound mechanism for exclusion. Studio executives did not have to publicly express bigotry. They simply deferred to the insurance underwriters. We'd love to cast you, but we can't get you bonded. This was the sanitized, bureaucratic death sentence handed down to Murphy and countless others. By the winter of 1988, Murphy was entirely consumed by the disease. The medical realities of AIDS in the late 1980s were horrific. Antiretroviral therapies were in their infancy. The primary treatment available, AZT, was highly toxic, frequently causing severe anemia, muscle wasting, and debilitating nausea, often accelerating an accelerated physical decline as much as the virus itself. Murphy, once the radiant athletic teen idol gracing the covers of adolescent magazines, was reduced to a skeletal figure. He died on December 6, 1988, in Sherman Oaks, California. He was 29 years old. The moment his heart stopped, the Hollywood public relations machinery activated its crisis management protocols. The objective was absolute containment. For Lorimar Productions and CBS, Murphy's death posed a distinct threat to the lucrative syndication value of the Dallas episodes featuring Mickey Trotter. The brand of Dallas was built on aspirational wealth, family drama, and escapism. Associating the franchise with the grim reality of the AIDS epidemic was deemed an unacceptable financial risk. Consequently, a coordinated campaign of historical revisionism began immediately. Press releases were carefully sterilized. The official obituaries distributed to and subsequently printed by major news outlets cited his cause of death as heart failure or a prolonged illness. The word AIDS was meticulously scrubbed from the public record. The networks demanded a sanitized narrative, and the entertainment press, deeply dependent on access to the studios, largely complied. Murphy was quietly buried, his cause of death obscured to protect advertising revenues. In a devastating footnote to the Murphy family's history, the tragedy did not end with Timothy. 13 years later, his younger brother, Patrick Sean Murphy, a successful businessman, was killed in the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. The Murphy family was forced to endure two of the most defining and public tragedies of late 20th and early 21st century American history. While Timothy Patrick Murphy was erased in absolute silence, another actor on the Dallas payroll was operating on a collision course with the very same corporate apparatus. But his trajectory and his ultimate reaction would be fundamentally different. Enter Dak Rambo. If Murphy was the vulnerable teen idol, Dak Rambo was manufactured to be the quintessential dominating alpha male. Born Norman J. Rambo on November 13, 1941, in Early Mart, California, he entered the industry alongside his identical twin brother Dirk. They were discovered in the early 1960s by Hollywood royalty. actress Loretta Young saw the 21-year-old twins sitting in a church pew and immediately cast them in the new Loretta Young show. Rambo was forged in the old guard system of Hollywood. He learned early on how a public image was constructed and aggressively maintained. Following the tragic death of his twin brother Dirk in a road accident in 1967, Dak navigated the industry solo, building a formidable resume through the 1970s and early 1980s, with appearances on rugged, male-centric shows like Gunsmoke, The Virginian, and Magnum, P.I. By the time he was cast as Jack Ewing on Dallas in 1985, Rambo's brand was fully solidified. Jack Ewing was designed by the writers to be the rugged, adventurous cousin, a man exuding raw, traditional masculinity who could believably spar with the ruthless, as J.R. Ewing. Rambo leaned heavily into this branding. To capitalize on his status as a sex symbol for female viewers, he actively promoted a line of men's underwear bearing his name. He was frequently photographed for the press, projecting an aura of unapologetic heterosexual dominance. But this hyper-masculine public persona was a highly fortified camouflage. Off-screen, Dak Rambo was a bisexual man. The psychological architecture required to sustain such a massive public deception is inherently unstable. Being bisexual in 1980s, Hollywood carried a unique compound stigma. You were viewed with suspicion by the heterosexual executives who demanded absolute conformity, and often marginalized by the underground gay community who demanded allegiance. Rambo was trapped in an exhausting liminal space, constantly policing his behavior, his associations, and his speech. To cope with the immense, suffocating pressure of his fabricated reality, Rambo developed severe, well-documented substance abuse issues. He began self-medicating heavily with alcohol and prescription sedatives. It is crucial to maintain an objective perspective on his career. Rambo was not merely a victim of an intolerant system. His own actions severely complicated his professional standing. His heavy drinking and drug use frequently spilled over into his professional life. He developed a reputation on various sets for unpredictable behavior, missed calls, and difficult interactions with crew members. Long before his health became a fatal issue, Rambo was providing network executives with ample ammunition to question his reliability. He was a highly bankable asset, but he was becoming an increasingly volatile one. The fortress he had built around his sexuality was holding, but the foundation was rotting from the chemical dependency he used to survive the lie. He was standing at the precipice of the 1990s, armed with a lucrative network contract, a carefully curated alpha male image, and a destructive addiction, entirely unaware that a blood test was about to force him into open warfare with the entire television industry. In August 1991, the precarious architecture of Dak Rambo's life collapsed. While working as a regular cast member on the NBC daytime soap opera, Another World, a routine medical examination returned a positive test for HIV. For a high-profile television actor in the early 1990s, a positive diagnosis was not merely a private medical crisis. It was a ticking public relations time bomb. The tabloid journalism industry, spearheaded by publications like the National Enquirer, had built a highly lucrative cottage industry out of outing closeted celebrities and exposing HIV diagnoses. They operated with ruthless efficiency, frequently bribing clinic workers, hospital staff, and laboratory technicians for confidential medical records. Rambo, an industry veteran, understood the mechanics of this predatory ecosystem. He knew that a leaked story was inevitable. The tabloids would frame his illness as a scandalous, sordid secret, effectively destroying the remaining fragments of his career and his dignity. Standing at the intersection of a fatal diagnosis and imminent public exposure, Rambo made a tactical, unprecedented decision. He refused to let the tabloids dictate the narrative of his death. He would not wait to be exposed. He would expose himself. In a move of staggering professional courage that shocked the conservative television establishment, Dak Rambo bypassed the traditional PR crisis management route. He did not issue a carefully worded, ambiguous statement. Instead, he went directly to the public. In a series of national television interviews, he stated with absolute clarity that he was HIV positive. Furthermore, he dismantled the hyper-masculine heterosexual facade he had maintained for nearly 3 decades, publicly confirming his bisexuality. To understand the magnitude of this confession, one must remember the era. In 1991, the stigma surrounding HIV was absolute. Magic Johnson's watershed announcement was still months away. For a mainstream heartthrob, a man who had quite literally sold his name on a line of men's underwear, to stand before Middle America and admit he belonged to the demographic most vilified by the epidemic was an act of profound rebellion. The industry's retaliation was swift and legally ruthless. The executives at NBC and the producers of Another World did not offer support, nor did they attempt to accommodate his medical needs. They immediately invoked the morality clause embedded in his contract. Rambo was fired. The justification provided was chillingly pragmatic. The network argued that the presence of an openly bisexual man dying of AIDS would make their conservative daytime viewing audience uncomfortable. This dismissal exposed the deep systemic hypocrisy of the Hollywood machine. The morality clause was ostensibly designed to protect the public from scandalous behavior. Yet Rambo was fired not for a crime, nor for the severe substance abuse that had previously impacted his set behavior, but for an act of radical honesty regarding a medical condition. The network weaponized the legal frameworks of morality to execute a purely financial maneuver. By terminating his contract, they instantly severed his connection to their corporate health insurance policies, insulating their bottom line from the astronomical costs of his impending medical care. The financial reality of an AIDS diagnosis in 1991 was apocalyptic. The primary antiretroviral drug available, AZT, was notoriously expensive, often costing a patient upwards of $10,000 a year, a figure that did not include the cost of treating the myriad opportunistic infections that accompanied the disease. By firing Rambo, the network systematically dismantled his survival infrastructure. Without a network contract, Rambo lost his eligibility for his Screen Actors Guild health insurance. SAG policies were rigorously tethered to active employment. If you did not accumulate enough hours on a sound stage, your coverage vanished. Overnight, a man who had starred on top-rated international television programs found himself effectively bankrupted by the medical system. To afford the grueling treatments required to keep him alive, Rambo was forced to systematically liquidate his life. He sold his home. He sold his personal assets. The wealth accumulated over a 30-year career was incinerated by medical bills. The isolation that followed was absolute. The directors, producers, and network executives who had profited immensely from his rugged good looks and marketability completely severed ties. His phone stopped ringing. In Hollywood, failure and illness are treated as contagious diseases. Rambo was blacklisted not by a formal committee, but by a silent, collective consensus of self-preservation, among the industry's elite. Yet stripped of his wealth, his career, and the suffocating burden of his fabricated image, Dak Rambo found a different kind of purpose. He did not retreat into the shadows as Timothy Patrick Murphy had been forced to do. Instead, he channeled his anger into aggressive advocacy. He spent the final 3 years of his life working fiercely for AIDS charities and awareness programs. He traveled the country, giving speeches and dismantling the stigma that had cost him his livelihood. He confronted the reality of his past, openly acknowledging his years of alcoholism and drug abuse, framing them not as glamorous Hollywood excesses, but as the toxic coping mechanisms of a man forced to live a lie. Dak Rambo died on March 21st, 1994, at the age of 52. He did not die on a television set. He died having been systematically stripped of his resources by the industry he helped build. His death proved definitively that the networks prioritize the comfort of their advertisers over the lives of their talent, setting a chilling precedent for those who remained on the payroll. Watchins. Gee, this brutal execution of Rambo's career was another Dallas veteran. He saw the financial ruin, he saw the blacklisting, and he decided that to survive, he would have to master the art of the perfect agonizing lie. His name was Tom Fuchello. If Timothy Patrick Murphy was erased in the shadows and Dak Rambo was executed in the public square, Tom Fuchello represented the third and perhaps most agonizing archetype of the Hollywood AIDS crisis, the pragmatic survivor. Fuchello did not possess the youthful, malleable innocence of a teen idol, nor did he carry the volatile, hyper-masculine burden of a manufactured sex symbol. Born in 1936 in Newark, New Jersey, Fuchello was a classically trained, highly disciplined professional. He built his foundation not on magazine covers, but on the rigorous, demanding stages of Broadway. When he transitioned to television, he brought with him a gravitas that casting directors utilized to ground their soap operas. On Dallas, Fuchello portrayed Senator Dave Culver, the stepson of Donna Culver Krebs. He was the embodiment of institutional authority, traditional masculinity, and political reliability. He was, in industry terms, the ultimate working actor. He was a reliable, steady presence who elevated every scene he was in, but he was not pulling the astronomical salaries of the primary Ewing cast members. His financial reality was fundamentally different. Rambo had millions to liquidate before he faced destitution. Fuchello operated with a much thinner financial buffer. His survival was entirely dependent on maintaining a continuous stream of guest, starring, and recurring roles. By the late 1980s, Fuchello found himself staring down the barrel of an HIV diagnosis. Fuchello was a highly observant man, and he possessed a cold, analytical understanding of the Hollywood machinery. He had witnessed the silent, absolute erasure of Timothy Patrick Murphy. He saw how the industry simply stopped returning calls. The moment the physical symptoms of the virus became visible. Later, he would watch Dak Rambo attempt a strategy of radical honesty, only to see the networks instantly weaponize the morality clause, strip him of his employment, and sever his health care. Looking at this data, Fuchello deduced a grim, inescapable conclusion. There was no scenario in which transparency resulted in survival. Rebellion was a luxury he could not afford. Advocacy would result in immediate financial ruin. If he wanted to live, if he wanted to afford the crushing costs of the few experimental treatments available, he had to engineer a flawless, impenetrable deception. He had to stay on the call sheet. To understand the sheer desperation of Fuchello's strategy, one must examine the strict, unforgiving mechanics of the Screen Actors Guild health insurance policy during this era. SAG insurance was not a guaranteed benefit for anyone holding a union card. It was a conditional privilege, strictly tethered to active, documented employment. To qualify for Tier 1 health coverage, the only tier comprehensive enough to handle the catastrophic costs of AIDS, an actor had to earn a specific, substantial threshold of income from SAG franchise productions within a given calendar year. If you fell ill and could not work, you did not merely lose your paycheck. You lost your health insurance exactly when you needed it most. It was a brutal catch-22 designed by corporate actuaries to protect the insurance pool. You needed the insurance to afford the medication to keep you alive, but the medication and the disease made you too sick to work the hours required to keep the insurance. Fuchello chose to override his own physical collapse through sheer force of will. He committed to a strategy of absolute stealth. He understood that the moment the network executives, the casting directors, or the insurance underwriters suspected he was ill, his SAG card would become useless paper. Entering the 1990s, Fuchello continued to book jobs. He secured recurring roles and guest spots on highly visible, glossy television shows, including the daytime behemoth The Young and the Restless, and the primetime cultural phenomenon Beverly Hills 90210. But the physical toll of the virus and the highly toxic side effects of early AZT regimens were systematically destroying his body. AZT was infamous for causing profound cachexia, severe muscle wasting, and catastrophic weight loss. Fuchello, once a robust, broad-shouldered man who convincingly played a United States senator, was shrinking. To maintain the illusion of health on sets surrounded by youthful, vibrant casts, Fuchello turned his wardrobe into a fortress. He could no longer rely on his natural physique. He began utilizing heavily padded suits. He instructed costume departments, often under the guise of character choices or personal tailoring preferences, to build out the shoulders and chests of his jackets, creating an artificial silhouette to hide the severe atrophy of his muscles. He wore multiple layers of clothing under the hot studio lights to disguise his emaciated frame. The deception extended to the makeup chair. The virus often caused the face to hollow out, creating a distinct sunken appearance that was easily recognizable to anyone familiar with the epidemic. Fuchello endured hours in the makeup trailer, requiring thick, heavy applications of stage foundation and contouring to visually fill out his cheeks and mask the pallor of chronic illness. This was not an act of vanity. It was a daily, agonizing performance for survival. Every time the director yelled "action," Fuchello had to suppress the chronic fatigue, the nausea, and the physical agony of a dying immune system, projecting the steady authoritative energy that casting directors were paying him for. He was essentially working two jobs simultaneously, playing the character in the script and playing the role of a healthy man for his employers. But perhaps the most disturbing element of Fuchello's final years was not the deception he orchestrated, but the silent complicity of the industry that surrounded him. The mechanics of Tom Fuchello's daily survival relied on an unspoken industry-wide protocol known as willful ignorance. A television set is a highly intimate, high-definition environment. It is impossible to hide a terminal illness from the hair and makeup artists who touch your face at 5 a.m., the wardrobe assistants who tailor your padded suits, or the directors who meticulously frame your close-ups. They saw the hollowed cheekbones. They felt the severe weight loss beneath the heavy wool jackets. They watched an esteemed veteran actor struggle to catch his breath between takes. Yet nobody asked a single question. This collective silence was not necessarily born of malice. It was a deeply ingrained survival mechanism mandated by the legal and financial structures of Hollywood. In the corporate hierarchy of network television, knowledge was liability. If a line producer or a director officially acknowledged that an actor was suffering from a life-threatening illness, they were legally obligated to report that information to the studio executives and the completion bond guarantors. The moment it was on the official record, the insurance underwriters would pull the plug, the actor would be fired, and the production could face costly delays. Therefore, the most merciful and legally safe action a crew could take was to simply pretend nothing was wrong. It was a bizarre, tragic pantomime. The makeup department applied thicker foundation to mask his pallor, framing it as a lighting adjustment. Wardrobe departments provided the heavy shoulder pads, writing it off as a character choice. Directors shot him from specific angles to minimize his frailty, framing it as a creative decision. Everyone did their job to ensure Fuchello could hit his marks, say his lines, and secure the vital Screen Actors Guild hours he desperately needed to pay for his medical care. They kept his secret by violently ignoring it. But this conspiracy of silence, while financially necessary, condemned Fuchello to absolute, suffocating isolation. Unlike Dak Rambo, who found a community and a voice in his final years through aggressive activism, Fuchello was trapped in a prison of his own making. He could not seek comfort or solidarity. The early 1990s saw the rise of vital, highly active AIDS support networks and clinics in Los Angeles. But for Fuchello, walking into one of these buildings was out of the question. Tabloid photographers from publications like the National Enquirer routinely staked out these clinics, photographing license plates and bribing staff to out-closeted celebrities. For Fuchello, attending a single support group meant risking his health care, his career, and his financial solvency. He was forced to endure the terrifying progression of the disease entirely alone. He managed his brutal AZT regimens in the strict privacy of his trailer or his apartment. He navigated the terrifying opportunistic infections without the psychological support system that is crucial for terminal patients. He was a man dying in the center of one of the most populated, interconnected industries on Earth, completely cut off from humanity. By the summer of 1993, the sheer physical exertion required to maintain the lie became unsustainable. The virus had advanced beyond the point where heavy makeup and padded suits could mask the reality. His body was failing. The ironclad professionalism that had defined his career could no longer override the biological collapse of his immune system. Fuchello was forced to quietly step away from the cameras. He retreated to his home, away from the studio lights and the intense scrutiny of the network machinery. On August 16, 1993, Tom Fuchello died in Los Angeles. He was 56 years old. The immediate aftermath of his death executed the final clinical stage of the Hollywood erasure protocol. When a prominent actor dies, the public relations firms and network representatives coordinate the release of information. Their primary objective in the 1980s and early 1990s was to protect the brand value of the properties the actor was associated with. Dallas was still a massive syndication asset. Beverly Hills 90210, where Fuchello had recently guest starred, was a billion-dollar teenage empire built on a highly curated, glossy aesthetic. Associating these brands with the grim, politically charged reality of the AIDS epidemic was deemed an unacceptable risk to their advertising revenue. Therefore, the network machinery sanitized his exit. The official press releases distributed to the major wire services and subsequently printed in newspapers across the country were brief and clinically vague. They stripped him of the truth of his battle. The obituaries noted his extensive Broadway background, his reliable presence on television, and his memorable tenure as Senator Dave Culver. But regarding his cause of death, the press releases universally cited complications from a long illness. The word AIDS was entirely absent. This omission was the ultimate indignity. Fuchello had spent his final years enduring profound physical and psychological torture just to play by the rules of an industry that viewed him as a disposable commodity. He had suffered in silence to protect their insurance pools and their advertiser comfort. And in return, the industry stole the truth of his death. They falsified his final public record to ensure that the reruns of his shows could continue to generate millions of dollars without making a conservative viewer uncomfortable. The death of Tom Fuchello completed a devastating triad. Murphy was discarded the moment his body failed. Rambo was fired the moment he spoke the truth, and Fuchello was forced to act until he physically collapsed, only to have his reality erased on his death certificate. Together, their trajectories formed the definitive empirical evidence of how a corporate empire handled a human crisis. To examine the intertwined fates of Timothy Patrick Murphy, Dak Rambo, and Tom Fuchello is to dismantle a persistent, sensationalized Hollywood myth. For decades, tabloid journalists have lazily grouped the premature deaths of these actors under the umbrella of a Dallas curse. But there was no supernatural hex on the set of Dallas. There was only a cold, highly calibrated economic machine executing its legal protocols. The true aftermath of their deaths is found in the eventual reform of entertainment labor rights, the blatant weaponization of the morality clause. To fire Dak Rambo, combined with the catastrophic failure of a Screen Actors Guild health insurance system that tied life-saving coverage to impossible physical labor, provided undeniable evidence of systemic exploitation. The public and private destructions of these actors fueled critical momentum for HIV/AIDS labor activists throughout the 1990s. Their cases starkly illustrated that the industry could not be trusted to self-regulate. This forced unions to reevaluate how terminal illnesses were handled, paving the way for fierce legal challenges that eventually secured stricter medical privacy and anti-discrimination protections in standard industry contracts. They were the collateral damage that forced a multi-billion-dollar industry to close its most lethal legal loopholes. When we look back at the cultural behemoth of Dallas, the Ewing family represented a fictional brand of ruthless American capitalism. Yet the genuine ruthlessness existed entirely off-camera in the network boardrooms that financed the illusion. Timothy Patrick Murphy was mass-produced as a flawless commodity, then discarded into absolute obscurity the moment his reality became a liability. Dak Rambo attempted radical transparency and was instantly bankrupted by the executives he had helped enrich. Tom Fuchello understood the machine so perfectly that he utilized ST.G. makeup and padded suits to endure a silent, agonizing physical decline solely to protect his health insurance. These men were not victims of fate. They were casualties of a corporate culture that placed absolute supremacy on advertising revenue. They were forced to navigate an impossible labyrinth where the only options were to lie and suffer, or to speak the truth and be destroyed. Their legacy remains a sobering factual record of an era when Hollywood demanded its actors surrender their youth, their health, and ultimately the truth on their death certificates just to protect a network's bottom line.